The Hague
Kia
Initiative
ora,
for
talofa
International
lava.
A
Cooperation.
very important word.
And almost every language
Israel
other than
Institute of New
English
Zealand.
and
My
French.
roots come from Jerusalem.
I'm Ashley Church from the Israel Institute of New Zealand. I'm here again today, as always, with Dr. David Cumin, a fellow director of the Institute, and this is the Israel Report.
So today we're going to be talking a little bit about media bias.
Yep.
And Ashley, you've got a lot of experience in the media. How do you see the bias vis-a-vis Israel compared to other biases that might exist in our media?
Oh, look, it's fascinating. And so one of the truisms, I think, with media worldwide for a long time has been that the victor tells the story. So if you look at British history and American history over the last 100 years, the story of history, particularly from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, is told through the eyes of those parties, because they're the victors, if you like, within the context of the history that they tell. And so I say that because there is an element of the narrative being determined by who's telling the story. And so when it comes to Israel, for a long time after 1948, there was a sense that the Western world, because it supported Israel, also told a story that was strongly supportive of Israel as a nation. That's definitely changed. It's changed since the 70s, and it's accelerated that change over the last probably 25 to 30 years.
Why do you think it changed in the 70s?
Well, in the 70s, there were a number of things. There's an excellent book, and I've forgotten the name of the author, but the book itself, and I'd encourage people to go and look for it, it's called Making David into Goliath. And it actually talks about the 7 or 8 factors which actually changed. One of them was the world's reliance on oil, and therefore the attitude toward Arab nations changing as a result of the need to rely on nations to provide them with oil. But there's a range of other things that took place. There was also a parting of the ways between the left, which had previously been a strong supporter of Israel because of the kibbutz movement. And as Israel became more centrist in its political position, the left diverged and went into a whole range of other issues. And that also had an impact on that divergence of support for Israel throughout the Western world. And you can see that outplaying over the last 10 or 15 years in the way in which the left has become a very strong, not a supporter of Israel, in fact has been very opposed to Israel. So there's been a very clear divergence. The problem we've got, and over the last 10 or 15 years, New Zealand, which has been a pretty reasonable country when it's come to treating issues such as the Israel-Palestinian issue, has had sort of almost a détente approach to Israel in that what it's done is because there's been strong views on one side and strong views on the other side, it's sort of taken this view of, well, a pox on both your houses, we won't cover anything.
Right.
And so for a long time, most of that material didn't make its way into the media space for that reason. That's definitely changed. Certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, that's changed quite dramatically. And what we're finding, and the Israel Institute's right at the forefront of this, is that there is now coverage of issues on one side of this debate and no countervailing balanced coverage on the other side of the debate. And we know, and it's not for lack of information, we're often out there trying to get information across, and we simply find it's difficult and sometimes impossible to do that.
But aren't there regulations around media companies needing to be balanced, the Broadcasting Standards Authority, for example?
There are, but those things tend to refer more to what was said rather than the ability to say it in the first place. So that balance, that BSA coverage tends to be more about whether something was true or not, and often that's subjective. Often it comes down to nuances over what was actually said. And what it doesn't do, what that legislation doesn't do, is it doesn't say if you have a view from one party, you have to have a view from the other as well.
Right.
So there is no party that actually requires media to make sure that they balance debate on both sides of an issue.
Well, I personally, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we want our media to be free and independent and do the things that they do. I recall, though, there was in 2014 a lot of media coverage of the Gaza war, and a lot of that was imbalanced and some of it was incorrect. And we put in some complaints at the time. And some of those were upheld, actually.
Yes.
Which is great.
So if you push back, sometimes that pushback will win, and it's simply because when you look at the facts of the situation, basically you have to find that way. So it's important for us to continue to do what we do and to make sure that both sides of this debate are actually covered. But I guess the concern that I've got is that I think the other thing that's changed is prior to perhaps 1985, 1984, certainly the mid-80s, there was a generation of Kiwis who had an understanding of this issue. And so if those people moved into journalism and into the media space, often they would come to that space with an understanding of both sides of the issue and at least some sort of objective basis upon which to hold an opinion. Right. We've got a generation, and this is a generalisation, so to be fair, but we've got a generation where some of those who are coming into media now don't necessarily have that objective basis upon which to draw their views. They've come from universities which are promoting overwhelmingly one particular position. They're not giving that counter view. And so we've got people who are coming with a predetermined and predisposed idea, that they are actually bringing to the views that they articulate through what they write in the media and cover in the media space.
And it's quite a challenge to confront that and to educate and to work on that. It's
very
difficult. It's a long-term project, I think, that we need to be investing in.
Yeah, and so it means that organisations like the Israel Institute and other organisations that are active in this space play a really, really important role, because it means that in some cases it's the only information that's actually going to be available to these people. And we know, because we're often issuing media releases on these various issues, that sometimes even if those issues aren't being used, and often they're not, it's important for people to understand, not that we're not necessarily confronting these issues, it's sometimes just that what we say is not being picked up. But even in those cases, when we do that, the mere fact that journalists and people in the media space are actually reading these releases means that over time they're actually being provided with information that's going to go some way toward balancing up the information that they're getting from this very one-sided position.
Right, and I think actually that's a great thing for our viewers to realise as well, is if you see something that is imbalanced or biased, write in or tell us about it so that we can try and work on that. And if there's a story that you see that's a positive story, send it to your local media or to the national media in the hopes that it gets picked up. Because the more positive messages, the more balanced messages we can get out there, the better, rather than always attacking when there's something that's wrong. We don't want to be fighting fires as much as keeping everything cool to start with.
And of course, as bad as it is here in New Zealand, and it's getting worse, it's significantly worse globally. So we're going to be looking at a video a little bit later on, and which is going to be introduced with a guy called Matty Friedman, who made an address on this very topic. He was with the Associated Press for a number of years, and he talks about the overwhelming interest in this issue through global media organisations and the very large numbers that are devoted to this tiny little nation and this issue, as opposed to the much smaller numbers of journalists who are actually devoted to other issues in the Middle East, and the very politicised approach that those media organisations bring to this view. So they're not objective, they bring a politicised viewpoint, a very biased and nuanced viewpoint, which is influencing the way that people think about the issue, because they're being confronted with this stuff all the time.
I think that's a fascinating point, that the focus that Israel has, a country that's half the size of Canterbury,
Absolutely.
Is totally disproportionate. It's not only the media that has that disproportionate focus, it's also our political institutions, the United Nations, and generally in society. It's a fascinating point. So the media is no different in that. And I think part of the reason for that is that they are able to. Israel allows media in, has a very critical self-media, and doesn't harm or threaten journalists in the way that other countries do. So it's safer in a way to be critical without having the consequences that you might have in countries like Turkey or Iran, for example.
Absolutely.
So you were presenting that media clip,
Yes.
and I think we should take a look at it.
Although the term fake news has only become mainstream in the past couple of years, the practice of news organisations putting their own slant on the way news is covered and presenting information in a way which promotes one position by undermining another is not new. Sadly, it's been happening to Israelis for decades. In a 2015 speech, former Associated Press reporter Matty Friedman said that during the years he spent as part of the International Press Corps, he became aware of certain malfunctions in the coverage of the Israel story, and he noted that decisions were being made according to considerations that were not journalistic, but political. He was right. The media narrative around Israel presents the story as a David and Goliath battle in which the Palestinians are the underdogs and the Israelis are the aggressors, ignoring or sometimes justifying the violence and the hatred of the terror groups Hamas and Hezbollah and of the Palestinian Authority, which continues to glorify terrorism, pays cash to imprison terrorists and to the families of martyrs, and incites the population to hate and murder Israelis. Let's look at a couple of examples. In June 2018, Hamas staged a series of violent riots, which they called the Great March of Return, in which tens of thousands of people attempted to storm the border fence between Israel and Gaza. Viral clips showed armed Gazans at the fence shouting, "Kill the Jews," while others showed Gazans cutting through the fence, throwing Molotov cocktails and launching explosives attached to balloons. There were also worrying images of child soldiers. Hamas leadership even admitted that a significant number of armed Hamas combatants were in the crowds, with the goal of crossing into Israel and capturing or killing Israeli civilians. Yet contrast this reality to the way that the march was described in media reports, as a peaceful protest with a carnival-like atmosphere, picnicking families and ice cream vendors, imagery which was clearly designed to portray the Gazans as peaceful. The 130 Palestinians who were killed in the Hamas-sanctioned violence as innocent victims, and Israel as a bloodthirsty aggressor. Here's another example. During those same riots, the Los Angeles Times ran a story with the headline, "Baby Girl Dies in the Haze of Gaza." It told the emotive story of an 8-month-old baby girl who was allegedly killed by inhaling tear gas fired by Israeli Defence Forces. The New York Times and other major outlets published their own version of the story, which framed Israeli soldiers as child murderers, and the story was both tragic and upsetting. It was also untrue. Following the extensive coverage, baby Layla's cousin admitted that she'd actually died from a pre-existing blood condition, and that Hamas had paid relatives to lie to the media. But that story, the truth, wasn't nearly as well reported, and the lie had already travelled around the world. Of course, not all media bias is so obvious. Sometimes it's achieved in the way pictures or headlines are used to influence public opinion. Take the example of a terrorist attack on a civilian Israeli bus in April of 2016, in which the headline became 21 injured in Jerusalem bus fire, with no reference to the cause of the injuries or the terrorist nature of the attack. Or a June 2016 terrorist attack on a Tel Aviv mall, which killed 4 and seriously wounded 3 others, but which was reported as 4 people killed in shooting, again with no reference to the cause or the perpetrators. Another media tactic is only to begin covering a conflict once Israel responds to being attacked, ignoring or minimising terrorist acts such as the firing of rockets from Gaza, so as to give the impression that Israel's actions are unprovoked. There are many other such examples, but where does this bias come from? Some of it comes from a lack of knowledge and ignorance of the facts, and no doubt in some cases the result of journalists simply wanting to fall into line with their peers by uncritically accepting the long-established anti-Israel narrative. But whatever their reasons, those who peddle in this propaganda betray the standards we should expect of their profession. So when you're confronted with an inflammatory headline about Israel, dig deeper. And when you find out what really happened, be sure to share what you've learned with others. In the words of an old TV show, the truth is out there. I'm Ashley Church for the Israel Institute of New Zealand.
The Hague Initiative for International
A
Cooperation.
very important
And almost every language
Israel Institute of New Zealand.
Roots come from Jerusalem.